The guards arrived at dawn. No warning, no trial. Just the sound of boots on stone and the creak of iron hinges swinging open. Inside the chamber, a queen stood frozen. Her gown, stitched with gold thread and pearls, hung heavy on her shoulders. Her breath came shallow. She had expected this moment for weeks, maybe months, but now that it was here, her hands trembled. One of the men stepped forward. He did not bow. He did not speak her title. He simply said her name, plain, stripped of rank, and gestured toward the door. She had been a queen. She had worn the crown. She had signed documents, attended councils, and smiled through banquets. But none of that mattered now, because behind palace walls, power was never truly hers. It was borrowed. Conditional. And when she broke the rules, or when someone decided she had, it could be taken back in an instant. This is the story of what happened when queens fell from grace. Not on battlefields, not in public squares, but in the cold, silent corridors of the very palaces they once ruled, where punishment was swift, brutal, and hidden from history for centuries. What did they do to deserve it? And how far did the crown go to keep it secret? To understand how queens were punished, you first have to understand what they were punished for. In the palaces of Europe, from England to France, Spain to Russia, a queen's role was clear. She was expected to produce heirs, to stay loyal, to remain silent when told, and above all, to never threaten the king's authority. But queens were also human. They had desires, ambitions, fears, and sometimes they made choices that powerful men could not forgive. Take Catherine Howard. In 1540, she became the fifth wife of King Henry VIII of England. She was young, barely 20 years old, with auburn hair and a quick smile. Henry adored her. He called her his rose without a thorn. He showered her with jewels, gowns, and titles. For a moment, it seemed like she had everything, but Catherine had a past. Before her marriage, she had been involved with other men, and after the wedding, rumors began to spread. Whispers in hallways, servants exchanging glances. Someone had seen something. Someone had heard something. And in a royal court, whispers were dangerous. The king's advisors began to investigate, quietly at first. They questioned servants. They read letters. They waited for proof. Catherine must have felt it, the shift in the air, the way people stopped meeting her eyes, the way Henry's affection began to cool. She was still queen. She still attended feasts and ceremonies, but the walls were closing in. In November 1541, the truth came out. Evidence of her past relationships, and possibly ongoing ones, was presented to the king. Henry was furious. Not just angry, devastated, humiliated. He had been betrayed by the woman he loved most. Catherine was arrested. Not publicly, not in front of the court. She was simply confined to her rooms. The doors were locked, the windows were watched, and the crown began to decide her fate. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner, and her punishment had only just begun. Catherine Howard was not the only queen to face punishment behind closed doors. Across Europe, royal women who broke the rules, or were accused of breaking them, faced consequences that were swift, severe, and carefully hidden. But what exactly did these punishments look like? Some were psychological. A queen might be stripped of her title, her servants, her possessions. She would be isolated, cut off from family, friends, and allies. Her rooms would grow quiet. No one would speak to her unless ordered. She would eat alone, sleep alone, wait alone. Days would stretch into weeks, weeks into months, and the silence itself became a form of torture. Others faced physical confinement. Queens were locked in remote towers, forgotten monasteries, or distant estates. They were watched constantly. Their letters were read. Their visitors were screened. Some were allowed to walk in small courtyards, but always under guard. Others never saw sunlight again. And then there were the punishments that went further. Catherine Howard spent her final days in the Tower of London. She was kept in a small chamber with stone walls and narrow windows. The cold seeped through the floor. The only sounds were footsteps in the corridor and the distant calls of ravens outside. Reports suggest she barely slept. She paced. She prayed. She asked for a block, the wooden block used for executions, to be brought to a room so she could practice laying her head on it. She wanted to die with dignity. She wanted to get it right. On the morning of February 13th, 1542, she was let out. No public trial, no grand ceremony, just a small group of witnesses in a private courtyard. She was 21 years old. The executioner was professional, quick. It was over in moments. But the memory of what happened and why lingered in the shadows of the Tudor court for decades. Catherine's story was extreme, but it was not unique. In France, queens who displeased their husbands were sent to convents, forced to take vows, to live as nuns for the rest of their lives. Their marriages were annulled, their children were declared illegitimate, and their names were erased from official records. In Russia, Tsarina Eudoxia Lopukina was punished by her own husband, Peter the Great, for opposing his reforms. She was accused of conspiracy, stripped of her title, and sent to a remote convent in 1698. She lived there for over 20 years, cold, isolated, and forgotten. Her head was shaved. Her gowns were replaced with rough cloth. She was no longer a queen. She was a ghost. In Spain, Juana of Castile, known as Juana la Loca or Juana the Mad, was declared unfit to rule after her husband's death in 1506. But many historians believe she was not mad at all. She was grieving. She was angry. She refused to remarry. She demanded control of her own kingdom, and so her father and son locked her away. For 46 years, Juana was imprisoned in a palace in Tordesillas. She had servants, she had food, but she had no freedom, no voice, no power. She died in 1555, still confined, still forgotten. These were not accidents. These were deliberate choices. Queens were punished not just for crimes, but for disobedience, for ambition, for refusing to disappear when told. And the worst part, most of the world never knew. The punishments did not end with confinement or death. They echoed through generations. When a queen was disgraced, her legacy was rewritten. Her portraits were removed from galleries. Her name was scratched from official documents. Her children were questioned, suspected, or removed from the line of succession. The crown wanted to erase her, not just from the palace, but from memory itself. Catherine Howard's execution was kept as quiet as possible. There was no public announcement beforehand, no grand procession. The witnesses were few, and they were sworn to silence. Afterward, her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the Tower of London. No headstone, no ceremony, just cold stone and silence. For years, visitors to the tower had no idea she was even there. Juana of Castile's imprisonment became a family secret. Her son, Charles V, ruled Spain and much of Europe. He told the world his mother was too ill to govern, but letters from the time suggest something darker. Servants reported that Juana was sometimes denied food, that she was kept in darkness, that she screamed for help, but no one came. One historian described her prison as a place where time stopped. The same rooms, the same walls, the same silence, for nearly half a century. And when she finally died in 1555, there was no grand funeral, no public mourning. Her death was announced quietly, almost as an afterthought. The woman who had once been Queen of Castile, Aragon, and Leon was buried without ceremony. Even queens who survived their punishments carried the weight of them forever. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard's cousin, had faced similar accusations years earlier. She was accused of adultery, treason, and witchcraft. The charges were almost certainly false, invented by Henry VIII's advisors to justify her removal. But it did not matter. She was arrested in May 1536, imprisoned in the Tower, and executed just weeks later. Before her death, Anne reportedly remained calm. She joked with her guards. She prayed. But in private, some witnesses said she wept, not for herself, but for her daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, who would grow up motherless, marked by scandal, and forced to prove herself for the rest of her life. The fall of a queen did not just destroy one woman. It sent shockwaves through the entire court. Servants were questioned, allies were arrested, families were torn apart, and the message was clear: no one was safe. Not even a queen. In the aftermath, the palace returned to normal. Banquets continued. Ceremonies resumed. New queens were crowned. But beneath the surface, the fear remained. Every woman who entered those halls knew the truth. Power was fragile. Loyalty was everything. And one mistake could cost her everything. The corridors where queens once walked grew quieter. Their chambers were reassigned. Their belongings were sold or burned. And slowly, carefully, the crown rewrote history. But the stories survived, passed down in letters, in whispers, in the memories of those who witnessed what happened behind closed doors. And centuries later, we are still uncovering the truth. What really happened to these women? Were they guilty of the crimes they were accused of? Or were they simply inconvenient, threatening, too powerful for their own good? The answers are buried in the same stones that once held them prisoner. The punishments queens faced were not just about justice. They were about control. A queen could be loved one day and erased the next. She could wear the crown, sign her name beside the king's, and still have no power to protect herself when the tide turned. And the most haunting part? We will never know how many queens suffered in silence. How many were locked away, forgotten, or quietly removed from history before anyone could write their names down. Catherine Howard died at 21. Juana of Castile spent nearly 50 years in a prison disguised as a palace. Anne Boleyn was executed on charges that were likely invented. And countless others, women whose names we have lost, faced punishments we can only imagine. Their stories force us to ask a darker question. What does it mean to be powerful? If that power can be taken away in an instant, what does it mean to wear a crown if the crown itself can become a cage? The palaces still stand. The towers still loom over the courtyards where queens once walked. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of footsteps, the rustle of silk, the quiet, desperate prayers. Because behind every throne, there was always a shadow. And in that shadow, queens paid the price for simply being human.